Canada's super obvious housing bubble.
So the point of this video is not to merely point out that there's a housing bubble in Canada. It's to point out how obvious it is that there's a housing bubble in Canada. What you are looking at right here is a graph of house price to rent ratio in Canada. Now the reason why this is important is because there's a lot of things within the laws of supply and demand that allow for house prices to go up. But there's nothing within the laws of supply and demand that allow house prices to go up without a corresponding increase in rent prices. If you'd like a basis for comparison, here's a graph of the house price to rent ratio in the United States over the same time period. Now, notice that in the United States, we also saw a large increase in the house price to rent ratio, but it also came crashing down. So our housing bubble has burst, and Canada's housing bubble is still going. But the facts still point to that just because it hasn't burst yet doesn't mean that they're not in the middle of a bubble. Other factors point to it too. First of all, household debt in Canada is still going up, and the savings rate in Canada is still going down. These are also signs of a housing bubble. People borrow more and save less to buy inflated house prices. These are the three most prominent signs of a housing bubble, and they're all there in Canada. Now, why am I telling you that there's a housing bubble in Canada? The reason isn't just to make a good prediction. It's because some people have been bragging about the fact that there hasn't been a burst bubble in Canada yet and pretending like it's because there was no bubble at all. Here is a clip of Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks telling you exactly what I'm talking about.
Now, they're going to do a G20 summit in Canada, and Canada is now the envy of all the European and obviously the American countries that are in G20, right? Because Canada's financial system did not implode. So, why did it not implode? Did they have a subprime meltdown? Nope. Did they have problems with their mortgages? Nope. And in fact, because of course of a worldwide recession, and obviously they're an enormous trading partner of America, they also had a recession. But they've already recovered. Their annual rate of growth in this year, in the first 3 months, was 6.1%. That's fantastic. They've already recovered 3/4 of the jobs that were lost in the recession. As opposed to us, we've hardly recovered any jobs we lost in the recession. Okay? They've recovered 3/4. And their banking system is perfectly healthy. Why? This is very important. One, it's tightly regulated. Even though they actually have very large banks. You know, we're worried about large banks here, but I've often said the size isn't necessarily the problem. Yes, it could definitely be a contributing factor, but the real problem is leverage. And point number 2 in Canada, they do not allow leverage like we do. Okay? So, I mean, some banks were just on the books, let alone off the books, were leveraged 30 to 40 to 1. So they're making $40 worth of bets on only $1 that they kind of have in the bank. Well, that's any gambler knows that's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, pause right here. I'm getting really pissed off at people who butcher the definition of leveraging. No one is making $30 worth of bets for every dollar that they actually have. What's happening is they're making $30 worth of bets for every dollar that they have in equity. What is equity? Equity is assets minus liabilities. So here's how it works. I'm going to borrow $900,000 to buy $1 million worth of stocks. Okay? That's $100,000 worth of equity because I put $100,000 of my own money into it as well as borrowed $900,000 additional dollars, and I now have $1 million worth of assets. The reason I'm going to do this is that if the interest on the loan is, say, 5%, and the stocks are going to go up 10% a year, then I make a lot more money than I would if I had simply not borrowed it. But this only makes sense if the rate of return is higher than the interest rate. If the rate of return was, say, 3% and the interest rate was 5%, well, then I would be worse off than I hadn't borrowed money. So the only time that banks leverage, i.e. borrow money to make investments, is when interest rates are really low and asset prices are skyrocketing. And with the government pretty much guaranteeing bailouts as well as making these interest rates artificially low, it's really not a surprise that so many banks were so over-leveraged.
And that's what happened to Lehman Brothers, and that's what happened to all the banks here. Well, Canada doesn't allow that. They say if you have a dollar, you can only bet so much, and it ain't 40, it ain't 30, it ain't necessarily 10. Okay, it's a smarter and safer system. Here's another thing they don't allow. They don't allow you to take mortgages, package them up, and sell them to someone else. Because if you do that, you give incentive to the people giving the mortgages to make crap mortgages. Oh yeah, who cares? You don't have income, you can't really pay it, it's overpriced. I don't care, just sign the damn thing. I'm going to package it together and sell it to this guy, right?
You know, Cenk talks a lot about all the regulations that Canada did have, but what he doesn't tell you is what regulations Canada didn't have. And believe it or not, the answer is GlassSteagall. Canada never had a provision that separated investment banks from commercial banks. You know, every liberal that I know says that separating commercial banks from investment banks is so astoundingly important that if we were to remove these regulations, the entire financial system would instantly collapse. And they usually point to this senator from North Dakota who predicted a recession within 10 years after the repeal of GlassSteagall. But there's two things here. One is that there's always a recession every 10 years, so this prediction doesn't really mean anything. But the real important part is that what these liberals often don't tell you is that the GlassSteagall Act was only passed in the USA and in Belgium. Allow me to read to you from a book called Unsettled Account, The Evolution of Banking in the Industrialized World Since 1800. Page 248 of the book. I read to you. The chairman of the Senate subcommittee examining these practices was Carter Glass, a vehement opponent of the affiliate system under which banks conducted investment banking activities through affiliated and often wholly owned institutions. Glass' persistence led to the enactment of the provisions in the 1933 Banking Act prohibiting member banks after June 16, 1934 from being affiliated with any company engaged in the, quote, issue, flotation, underwriting, public sale, or distribution at wholesale or retail or through syndicate participation of stocks, bonds, debentures, notes, or other securities. It also prohibited security dealers from taking deposits or allowing corporate connections between banks and security dealers. Now, here's the important quote. Are you ready? Aside from Belgium, which instituted a similar reform in 1934, no other country erected such a thorough separation between commercial and investment banking. In other words, Canada, Germany, Japan, Sweden, Norway, none of these countries ever had a GlassSteagall Act. But I keep reading. Research suggests that the abuses of the affiliate system highlighted by its opponents may not have been as dire as contemporaries believed. White, 1986, argues that the securities affiliates of national banks, which were spun off into separate entities as a result of the Banking Act of 1933, had not destabilized the U.S. banking system during the Great Depression. If we closely examine the history of bank regulation, it's very hard to make the argument that the Glass-Steagall Act in any way, shape, or form saved this country. We have a big recession right now, but so does the rest of the world. We had a big recession back in the early 1990s, and so did the rest of the world. We had some big bank failures in the mid-70s, and so did the rest of the world. And then finally, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, we had no major bank failures. And neither did the rest of the world. The only evidence ever given for the effectiveness of the Glass-Steagall Act is that we went 30 or so years without any bank failures. And once again, this is a global phenomena. No one saw bank failures during this period, and almost none of these countries ever had a Glass-Steagall Act. Don't let them fool you. Canada is going to have a humongous housing crash, and no reinstating Glass-Steagall ain't going to do shit. What causes these housing bubbles is setting interest rates too low. That's it. Period.